Hello and welcome to Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin and I'm joined today by Finbarr Doyle, who's MD of P4HB, Procurement for House Builders. Welcome.
Thank you.
Finbarr, you are in a very specialist and privileged position because you're right in between developers and material suppliers. So you get it from both sides, don't you?
Yeah.
And it gives you a marvellous opportunity for looking at what the state of the market is. And we're all struggling a little bit to know what the future holds. Why? Because we've got a new government. They are working at pace to change planning regulations, build more new homes, change what those homes are about to be. Is it all going to work?
If I had the answer to that question and I knew I was right, I wouldn't be sitting here. We wouldn't be sitting here talking to each other, would we?
We're quite well off, probably.
Look, I think that there's a couple of things to say first. What the government has announced is quite progressive. It's quite bold. They've come out very quickly from the blocks and said, we're going to we're going to build out 1.5 million homes and we're going to try and peak at 370 units a year. And that's really bold, given that if you look around all the constituent parts between planning, supply chain, skills and labour, there's also the subject of modular construction, there's also the policies and the regulations. And you could argue that either too much of it is changing too quickly or too often, in the case of planning regulation, for example, or that we're not keeping a pace with everything in all the moving parts for it to all come together. And I guess our take on it is that without collaboration from central government, manufacturing base, developers, big and small,
local authorities,
and the dysfunctional planning authorities as they are, without full collaboration of understanding what they can all bring to the table, I think we're going to continue to see frustration and perhaps even more frustration than there has been because there's now pressure to build.
Okay, well, let's just look at the planning aspect of this to start with. First announcement is they're going to send 300 new planning officers around the country to join up with the local authorities. Now, my question is that where do these people come from? And are they going to have a consistent view of what planning should be about? Because I don't see, I think we have roughly 300 different authorities that
so it equates to one for each,
One
right?
for each, and that's hardly going to be super influential, is it? And then on top of that, you've got a system where you have professional planning officers coming up with a decision, with a recommendation, and then you have 12 lay people sitting around a table saying, no, I don't like that.
Well, if you think about the dynamics, we all know what happens when something changes in an old system. So let's just picture this. You've got 300 new, let's say they do actually imagine up 300 new planning officers. So those planning officers are going into established planning offices with perhaps archaic thinking and systems. They're not exactly going to be necessarily welcome in with open arms and say, glad you're here, let's change how we do things. That's probably not going to happen. So that's already on the basis that you can actually find 300 officers. And we know from history does teach us things, and one of those things is that all the good planning officers have gone to advise the poor planning officers on how they should do their job. So you could just be starting a new cycle if you do find these new officers. Whether you can create 300 officers up and down the country who all think the same, I mean, people aren't automatons, so that and they can't come from central, so they have to be created through training and development. It's very difficult to maybe consider how they're going to bring this about. And I would argue that it's hard to imagine 300 officers coming on stream in a short space of time, but actually you need succession as well. So you actually probably need maybe 900 in the pipe in total to really make an effective change.
Okay, so that's the personnel side of things. The other practical consideration that just nobody seems to be discussing. Having been involved with property development for some years now, it occurs to me that a new development from design to finish on anything substantial is probably going to be a 3 to 4 year project.
If you take into account what's already in the system that isn't getting through, and the government has spoken about, new garden cities. We aren't talking about infrastructure yet. We're not talking, and we're still in consultation, etc. But if you think about the scale of what they're imagining they want to happen, and we're still not getting through, what is relatively a standard number of units going through the planning system, we're not getting through them. So there's already a bottleneck.
Yeah.
So pushing through more just doesn't make sense to me in terms of, well, we'll just push through more. It doesn't work. Really, if you look at some examples of large infrastructure projects, whether they be garden cities or whether you look at HS2 or whatever major project that you think of, I can't think of one in the last 20 years that's gone well.
Well, no. Or on budget.
Or on budget, or on time. I mean, it's a hard fact that in the UK, 60% of all projects, whether they be small house building developments or large infrastructure projects, 60% of all projects run both over time and over cost.
But we were talking off camera, Finbarr, and you were saying that you'd come across a situation where, in fact, houses that were planned, that had planning permission, that were due, if not already started, were not being used. Tell me.
There is this sort of disconnect in between the planning regulations and other regulations on the environmental front, and on there's a situation in Cumbria in particular where planning had gone through, they'd started to break ground, they started building out, only to realise that the water infrastructure and the environmental concerns that weren't addressed during the planning process would cause that developer to incur fines from central government. Right. And incurring fines from central government would mean that actually it becomes uneconomical to continue to develop.
Right.
So they've simply stopped.
And this is to do with the supply of water and the drainage of water.
Yeah,
and
both. And we were talking earlier about trying to reverse that and engineer infrastructure so that you could sell part of an infrastructure for development, and that makes a whole lot more sense and would avoid situations like this. But that situation in Cumbria is apparently one of quite a number of similar situations. Our research showed that there may be as many as 100,000 units that are paused or have received planning approval but cannot proceed because of fear of fines.
Well, that really is a nonsense, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you think that this business of Westminster getting more involved, and I'm just thinking here back to a statement that Angela Rayner made when she said, if I see a big development, I'm going to call it in, I'm going to look at it, and I'm going to monitor the progress. Are local authorities going to get very fidgety about Westminster interjecting into all of this?
I welcome the desire to try and break the deadlock. I'm not sure that's the solution. If you consider that already at a local level, that the NIMBYism and the poor decision making that already exists in planning is causing a lot of the reason why we have bottlenecks in the first place. Why would central government have expertise in signing off projects?
Well, that's the point, isn't it? Yeah.
Where's that expertise come from? And if they don't have the expertise, that means they're going to create another committee to review and overrule local committee. Now, that may in itself be welcome, but these things take time, and it puts another layer of process into an already elongated process. So I don't know how that actually works, and I think we need to see what detail comes through.
Yes. And do you think we will see the detail, or has this all been a sort of flurry of election nonsense, really?
I hope it's not. I really genuinely hope it's not election flurry. It may be that the numbers being thrown around are a little bit more than a little bit ambitious, But I think you've got to start somewhere, and you've got to, try and corral an industry that's not really been well looked after centrally by successive governments in the past or a couple of decades. So I think I'm taking that there's good intention in what they're trying to do. I'm not sure if there's good understanding of what the problem is.
I'm not sure commerce works on good intentions.
Yeah, exactly that.
Okay, Finbarr, we're going to go to a break now. After the break, what I want to do is just delve down a little bit deeper into the practicalities of what our government thinks they want to build.
Okay.
Join me again after the break, and I'll be asking Finbarr to explain more about government policies. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin and I'm joined by Finbarr Doyle, MD of P4HB, Procurement for Home Builders. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Now, we've talked a little bit about the planning process and whether that's going to make an awful lot of difference in the immediate future. We know what the government's aspirations are, and that's 1.5 million homes in the next 5 years or 4 and a bit years, whatever's left. I think that's highly ambitious because, as I alluded to in the first part of the programme, a development programme usually takes 3 or 4 years from inception to completion. I don't see where they're going to get the results from. And if we don't free up some of the things that are going on at the moment, it's just going to get worse, not better. You've outlined the case where something has been given permission, has been started in terms of construction, and then found to not meet government regulations in terms of efficiency with water. Now, for our viewers at home, I mean, one of the difficulties that we face these days is that drainage has become so efficient from these new housing estates and blocks of flats and things that within seconds of the rain hitting your roof, 2 minutes later it's in the river. But of course what this does is add the fuel to flooding.
Yeah.
And that's a real issue. So the government are quite keen to be careful over that, and developers must also be very careful because they suffer huge fines if they get it wrong. Now, what we've also got to think about is whether 1.5 million homes is a practical proposition, both in terms of people skilled enough to build them and the materials, which is Finbarr's particular interest here and speciality. Are there going to be enough materials, and are they going to be affordable?
Material supply at the moment is probably running. Last year we built 180 odd. I think it was about 181,000 units, and the supply chain operated reasonably efficiently around that. Ironically, I think only about 3,500 of those units were modular, so everything else was traditionally or timber frame built. But we still saw through that demand price increases of roughly around 8%. Some of the sort of key materials like concrete, insulation, bricks, etc., ran higher. I think it's basic economics. If you ask a system to provide more, costs go up. If you ask a system to provide less, sometimes costs go down, but not always. You see that in fuel, for example, that hasn't quite dropped back, has it?
I don't see much that comes down.
It doesn't necessarily, does it? It doesn't always go that way. Although there are some really good examples where it does happen, but I think that's, we'll leave that for another day.
Say that for another day.
Yeah, say that. Our take on it is that, unless there's real solid conviction built into the system that the government is serious, the government's plan is robust and can build, drive sort of on a trajectory towards an increased number of homes each year, then manufacturers can get some confidence. They can start to make strategic decisions in their manufacturing decisions about what volume they're going to build manufacture out, etc., and how they would do so. Without that confidence, manufacturers aren't going to spend money building or manufacturing product for building if they think the demand isn't going to be there. So I think that confidence is sort of part one of and that will only come from the planning reforms being adopted, them seeing that there is an easier way to get planning through the system, and they'll also need to see that the grey belt actually means something tangible, and that's yet to be seen.
Well, we better explain what the grey belt is.
Okay.
And my understanding is we have what we call the green belt, which are areas that are just no way can you build on. They've got to be protected. They've got to be preserved. But what we have within that green belt is certain areas that are not so attractive and not so green, and the government's intention is to filter those out of the green belt and make them available for construction. Now, that is going to be difficult because you're going to have arguments between the local authority and Westminster about which is green, which is grey, etc., etc. So I don't know how we're going to cope with that. I don't know how that's going to be adjudicated upon.
I've no idea,
No.
and nor have I really given it much thought or interest.
And I doubt if the government are either.
Probably not.
If we're honest.
Probably not.
The other thing I just want to bring up with Finbarr is when people say to me, "Oh, what's the property market doing?" And I say, "Well, what do you mean? What market? Do you mean residential, prime residential, low-end residential, London, central London, home counties?
Which radius line? Yeah.
What do you mean? So when the government say want to build 1.5 million homes, what kind? And the question there is you've got three basic types. You've got affordable homes, you've got social housing, and you've got residential.
Yeah.
Is it the same constructor that produces those three different types?
No, it's not. I think if you look at the underlying mechanisms that currently exist in house building, it's driven by what is becoming the big 5 or 6. There's currently the big 8, but there's mergers going on and with 4 big players right now. They kind of control the land banks. They, to a large extent, control what planning approves in terms of the leverage they've got, because ultimately they and the other thing they hold is how much money they want to make off the stock they build. So it's all very well the government saying we want X% of all housing to be affordable in a development, and that may be 15-20%, but we've seen over the past 5, 6, 7 years, maybe even longer, where developers have bought their way out of that because they just can't make the scheme work, or they just want more money off the scheme. And that's raw economics at play. So the government will have to intervene in those mechanisms if they want social housing to be built and affordable housing to be built in the type of numbers which should be built to allow people to get on the property ladder. And the irony is that the more houses you build, the more your costs go up. So material costs will go up if the demand goes up. If all of this works, to build a unit will go up. It's that simple. So at what point is an affordable home remain an affordable home? That's the sort of things we need to discuss now if we're to get the answers for later.
Yes. I mean, it's a little bit like saying it's a 30% discount, but discount from what?
Exactly that. Exactly that. Is it 50? Is it $500,000, or is it so on? So it's difficult to say.
Now, just on the material side of things, at what stage do you get involved talking to the developer, whether that developer be a local authority subcontracting his work out to presume a contracting firm, or whether it's a house builder that builds direct for his own purpose? At what stage do you get involved with the materials? How much planning goes into this?
If I take how when we talk to our clients, particularly our prospect clients who have yet to experience what we do for them, their approach would be, right, let's get through the planning, let's get approvals, let's understand roughly on a square metre basis what our cost of materials will be, what our cost of build will be, what our cost for the land will be, and we'll allow some contingency, and then more or less keep our fingers crossed that won't move too much. That's kind of the approach. When we work successfully with developers and contractors, we're actually working with them sometimes even pre-complete construction drawings, because we can help them get to a cost scenario where they really do understand the actual cost to build on a quite a granular basis. And by doing so, that allows them to understand what their investment, their skin in the game needs to be, but also what their return is likely to be.
Sure. Well, one thing I wanted to ask you, I don't want you to criticise of any of your customers or potential customers, but it just occurs to me, if the government is going to force local authorities to build more on their own account, great stuff. But are those local authorities capable of controlling these contracts, appointing the right kind of constructors? Do they have the skills to be able to do this? Or are we just going to end up with, shoddy buildings? And
well, I think there is, I was mentioning earlier about the law of unintended consequences. First of all, the local authorities can't control, I don't think, what ultimately happens, because there's too many variables that are outside of their control. There aren't enough contractors out there with labour forces to be able to build the 1.5 million units anyway. So that's a fact. I think that if you look at what's happening in terms of the planning regs, and we're on the third new wording of the planning regulation in 12 months. So planning officers who are already in maybe let's say an inefficient sort of mode, are trying to catch up on 3 planning wordings changes in the last 12 months. You have this drive for volume, and volume shouldn't mean less quality. But in previous experiences, when we built out fast and hard in history, in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s,
we got slums.
We got really poor quality housing stock that was substandard to live in, that needed far too often upgrading, and at a cost that was far outweighed by the value that was created in doing so, and then ended up having to knock them down because they were eyesores anyway. And there's a risk, I think, the unintended consequence potentially could be that with a lack of qualified labour, a drive for volume, looking at regulation that might not be keeping up with let's say modular build, or with what's acceptable in terms of a housing standard, there is I think a risk that we could end up right back to the 50s, potentially.
Okay. Finbarr, thank you very much for your words of wisdom. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Wish you a good year's business.
Thank you.
And let's hope the government get it right, shall we?
Let's hope.
Okay, there we are. That's all for today. So thank you for watching Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin. Join me again next time.